Typically, the issues and the contention and the problems resolve when you have a estate of assets and no one really knows what they are and what they're worth, but they have to be divided or distributed. And more importantly, probably equitably. So now it comes down to what is the values of these assets so we can make an equitable distribution. That is what Value Pros runs into quite often, where we meet that need by producing an independent appraisal report that allows the beneficiaries or the family members to understand what the assets are, so then they can make informed decisions, whether it's dividing the assets, selling the assets, donating the assets, throwing the assets away.
Welcome to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. If you ever asked, how do I protect myself and those I love if something unexpected happened to me? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Niki Weiss, and together we'll explore how to protect yourself in a world where both your physical and digital legacy leave a lasting impact. And welcome back to another episode of the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. And today, my guest is Ray Nugent. Now, Ray, you and I met actually through another friend who was a beta client of mine in working out her final playbook. And when I learned that you were an appraiser working with estates, I was intrigued. So please share with us your experience and what got you to this space.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Nikki, for being here. I appreciate the opportunity. And I always love enjoying talking about what I do. As a matter of fact, my role with Value Pros, and Value Pros, it's just it's a family firm. My father started back in the early 70s. I stepped into it about 25 years ago, and I just had a skill set that was able to take the business forward into the digital age and so on. So I've got wonderful people working around me, so it's very satisfying. But my main role with the company is basically just explaining what the service is, what an appraisal is, and what it's not, and how it can be used. So I'm always happy to talk about it. A large part of our business is for what's called estate settlement. Now, there's different things that go on with estate settlement. One could be literally the valuation of assets for a date of death, where the IRS requires to know the value of the assets because there's estate tax ramifications. Another is for equitable distribution, and that's what most people are familiar with. There's a small percentage in our country where estate tax is in play, and it's very wealthy people. Primarily, what people run into in their lives is, hey, a loved one just died, and I've been appointed an executor or a personal representative. And I don't have any idea what that is. And I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. All I know was an attorney told me to get an appraisal of the items. Okay. And and then
And what are those items? So those items, what would you define as estatable items?
Sure. So there's really two main asset categories that Value Pros appraises. It's real property, and that's real estate. So that's what people know as, the house and the land and all the rights that go with it. A home appraisal. That's a real estate appraisal. And then the other main category is called personal property, and that's the tangibles, the assets within the home. So when I talk to audiences, I explain that, what personal property is if you could literally pick your house up, rip off the roof and turn it upside down and shake it, everything that falls to the ground is personal property. Okay. Everything that sticks is real. It's attached to the house. Okay. So personal property. And personal property is all of those things that we live with and around in our lives, like furniture and furnishings, fine art, jewelry, collectibles, memorabilia, ceramics, silverware, all of those things. So Typically, the issues and the contention and the problems resolve when you have a estate of assets and no one really knows what they are and what they're worth, but they have to be divided or distributed. And more importantly, probably equitably. So now it comes down to what is the values of these assets so we can make an equitable distribution. That is what Value Pros runs into quite often, where we meet that need by producing an independent appraisal report that allows the beneficiaries or the family members to understand what the assets are so then they can make informed decisions, whether it's dividing the assets, selling the assets, donating the assets, throwing the assets away. Okay. So that's when it comes to an estate appraisal, that is where we come into play. Now, one thing that you and I had talked about before was really the importance of getting ahead of that situation.
That planning piece,
The
right?
planning piece, right? Because, in the book, I talk about downsizing and settling your estate. Now, settling an estate is typically done by other people because the person has died, okay? And they're settling it. Downsizing is really being proactive because what you're doing is you're getting your affairs in order. So then on your demise, you're not left a mess that other people have to clean up. And here's the thing as far as personal property, the contents within a home. No one knows those contents better than the person who acquired them through their life. Well, when that person is gone and then a relative steps in, then they don't know those things personally. So now it really makes it much more challenging for them to make decisions. For instance, like, what should I do with this? Or, should I even have it appraised? And so on. So I can't stress enough, and, perhaps we can go into it about how important it is to plan for the inevitable. No one gets out of here alive, right?
It is. It's amazing how some people are just having that difficult conversation. I mean, the part of what we talk about in Devo and building out a final playbook is to transform that conversation around death and dying to allow people know that it's inevitable and you've built this wonderful life. I mean, some people have spent their entire lifetime building a collection of something that they believe has value. But if you're coming either towards the end of your life or even not the end of your life, but you want to be well planned to go through that, it's an exercise, right? It said you're having a professional appraiser like yourself come in and walk us through what it would be like if I was to hire Value Pro to come into my home that I might have had, again, a lifetime worth of artwork, maybe some jewelry. How could I best plan for my family to not leave that mess behind?
Yeah. So I think it's, personally what I did for my father, who is still with us and just an amazing man, is that he was dragging his feet a little bit, I felt, in getting this issue in place. And it's understandable. I don't want to pick on my father here, but he's very
Not alone.
yeah, that's right. He's very
Not
typical.
alone.
Yeah.
No one wants to face their own
Yeah,
demise.
absolutely, and he's very typical. He has abundant life, so he had a fair amount of assets, but he was in a house that was just too large. He didn't need that much house anymore. He had a lot of stuff, and so finally we had one of our family dinners, and I just, there's no easy way to do it. You can't tiptoe around it. This is an issue. It's very serious. It needs to be addressed and need to be taken care of. And I just said to him and his wife, I said, "So when are you guys gonna start getting your life downsized and more manageable? Where are you with that?"
And how old were they?
Yeah,
How
and
old were
at
they?
the time, this was probably 8 years ago, and he was already about 80 years old, and it was overdue. It was way
I
overdue.
was gonna say 80 years old and still not willing to have that
Yeah,
conversation.
overdue. And I had my siblings with me. They didn't know I was going to do it, but it wasn't like it was an ambush. It's just it needed to be brought front and center. And
Mhm.
and the amazing thing was there was instant relief because they knew it needed to be done, right?
Wow.
Okay? So then we started the process of okay, let's just take one step and then we can take more steps because what happens is you look at a lifetime of accumulation of assets and you're comfortable, right? You're
Stuff.
yeah, you're
You were
sitting
saying
here,
assets.
everything
It's
is familiar. So you've sat around it forever and it's really hard to make that change. So you just break it down, right? You just break it down into small steps and then you get momentum and so on. So back to your question, what do we do? Contact an appraiser, an independent appraiser. My suggestion, and there's a place for it, but don't get into a discussion with dealers at an early stage. There's plenty of time to contact people that want to profit from your stuff. They're always going to be there. The first thing you got to do is talk to people that don't have an interest in financially benefiting from you. What they are is they're advisors, they're consultants. So we're talking about family law attorneys, state attorneys, independent appraisers. And we do this every day, right? And whatever odd you think your situation is, I've seen it, I've talked about it, I've addressed it, I've helped it. So contact an appraiser and say, here's what's going on. Okay. I've got this house full of stuff and I really need to wrap my arms around it because if I don't, I'm going to leave this to somebody else one day. And that's not, I don't want to use the word fair. It's not that it's not fair. It's just not the most efficient way to do it. Okay. So be proactive on it. And then what we do is we step in and say, okay, tell me a little bit about your stuff. What is it? Did you have a passion for collecting things? Do you have a lot of collectibles, maybe a special collection of figurines or sports memorabilia or fine wine, whatever your passion was. And maybe a lot of people don't have that. No, I just, I've got these things, but I've got some furniture that I paid a lot for and I've got some art. And so we just start to understand what their profile is, right? What their situation is. And then we talk about how we can help them through a detailed report understand what it is that they have, and really, most importantly, what the current market demand is. And
Right.
what market demand is value, right? So, what creates value is market demand. So, there's going to be things there that have more market demand, and that in itself helps you to start to organize and make decisions.
But it's also a timing, right? So I'm thinking of an aunt of mine, my husband's Aunt Saray, who for years had this doll collection, her beloved doll collection for 40 years, would spend go to the shows and collect these dolls. And for the longest time, she was very convinced that this was going to be her legacy plan to her family, leaving this doll collection. And lo and behold, there probably was a time when the doll market, had hit its peak. But by the time she left us and she had maybe over 600 dolls, that the value of it, I think it cost money to unload them than it did bring any sort of asset, risk exchange back into the family.
Right.
So, again, that understanding for what she was going through, what her mindset was versus the hard facts, which is what your team is bringing in, is like, no, it's not what you think the market is. Let's make an educated decision based on the market trends right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Nikki, I can't stress this enough that when I speak to people that are in this situation that you found yourself in, I let them go because they need to say it.
It's an emotional piece,
It's
right?
emotional, but half of the time they're trying to explain to me and justify why they don't want these things. Okay? And I say to them, look, you know, your aunt, bless her heart, her passion was dolls, right?
It brought
So
him so much joy.
absolutely. So those dolls that was something that she was very passionate about. That doesn't mean that the family members have any interest in dolls or want her dolls, right? So they tend to say, she really loved these, but, I just said, listen, if dolls are not your thing, then let's get to the bottom of what we can do with these dolls. In other words, let's perhaps monetize the dolls, right? Because let's turn her passion to revenue or money for you that would allow you to express your passion. It might be traveling. It could
That's the
be
legacy.
so many different things, right? Okay, so that's what we first, there's usually some slight amount of guilt that someone did this their whole life, and how could I just dismiss it and just say, I don't want it. So we work with that. Listen, these are family dynamics. It can be emotional, it can be sentimental, but we kind of cut through that. We listen to it, we understand it, but then we very quickly pivot to, okay, so let's address this issue. Here's your options. Here's what you should consider doing, and so on. Here's how we can help you. And then you just see the relief start to go because it's been a burden. It's been weighing on them. So,
So what happened when your father and I
yeah.
guess
And
his wife
his wife, yeah.
invited you into the house? So
Yeah, it was
here you
fan it
are,
was
your own
it was
family.
so fantastic. Yeah, because it
Oh,
really
yeah.
at his age and stage, it's what needed to happen. He was in a house that he didn't need. He didn't go in rooms anymore, and he had a lot of stuff. And, he's now on a fixed income and expenses are rising and, he's getting squeezed. So he's got all this stuff that becomes a financial burden because you got to have a lot of square footage to have it with you. And so then what we did was we started to allow him with information to understand what things he really wanted. He really wanted with him going forward. And then the rest of the stuff we start to peel off in different ways. Okay. And now they find themselves in, a smaller unit, much more affordable, easier to take care of. Those few special things other than furniture that they sit on comfortably, but those few special things are around them. So they have that, but all the rest of the stuff is gone. And it turned into revenue that allowed him to then, use going forward and so on. So, but that all came from planning. It all came from a plan and a strategy and then moving on it. And now he's in a much better situation. And probably most importantly, me and my siblings aren't knowing one day that we're going to walk into something that we're going to really scramble with. Now, I've got the skill sets to be able to do that, but obviously most people do not. And now, they're younger, they have lives, they have jobs, they have kids. They don't have time to stop their lives for a few months and jump
Into
into
mom
this.
and dad's house. I
Yeah,
mean,
they
that's
don't. Yeah.
where I hear all the time where people, first their parents become ill or disabled or incapacitated. So they have to take care of the physicality of their care. And then at the same time, they're trying to empty a house that they've lived in for 30, 40, 50 years and the accumulation. And there's a cost involved with that, right? I mean,
Oh,
dumpsters and
you're good.
water.
Nikki, you're good. I was just getting ready to say, okay, I need to touch on this because you know this, you experience this. Here's the thing, move me back into different areas when you want to, but I'm going to get into the hard truth about assets and about distributing assets, whether they go to family members or whether you sell them, right? The point is, the assets, they must go. That house cannot sit there full. It has to be resolved, right? Now, most people know that if you have something of value and you must sell it quickly, that's not a good position to be in, right? That's a difference between a fair value and a liquidation value. Okay. The only reason you're getting less money for that thing is because you got to move it on quickly. So that's the other thing about planning. When the person is alive, then they can take their time in making decisions and selling things. Now, I'm not saying that a senior person needs to jump into e-commerce and know how to sell things.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
not the case. The point is that there's different ways to sell things, but if you lack the time, it reduces your options. And then what you're doing is you're just throwing money away because you have something of value, but you don't have time to get it to the people that will pay the fair value. And that's where dealers and liquidators and estate people, that's what they hope for. That's what they're hoping for. They're
That
hoping,
desperation, they're
yeah,
feeding
they're
off
hope,
the
yeah,
desperation, the urgency, the lack of planning,
lack
the
of knowledge.
lack
Yeah,
of
I don't
knowledge.
know what
Yeah.
this thing is, right? And so they come in, and that's what I tell people when they say, "Look, I would like to know the value of these items because I want to sell." So I'm sure. So what you would like to know is, what is the current market demand, the value of items, so you can make informed decisions. Is that correct? And they say, "Yes, that's correct." I say, "Okay." So the whole point is that people that would be interested in buying from you, they hope you're not informed. They hope you don't know
They
what it's
didn't
worth.
plan.
They hope that you're in distress to move it quickly. And so what we just do is eliminate all those things because number one, it's stressful. It interrupts people's lives by having to step into this. And the third thing is that you're really going to take a haircut financially. And that money can go to your family, to the next generation, and so on. So I can't stress enough planning about addressing these issues.
So I know you're an appraiser, but it sounds like, do you have anyone on your team that's also a social worker? Because it
Mhm.
sounds like you're really, or is that just by
Yeah,
by design, that to be able to understand, because not to get into hoarding, right? And the psychology around people who hoard, if someone's living a 5,000 square foot house and they're in their late 70s, and that letting go process, it's still a tremendous amount of work. I'm thinking of my aunt and uncle who was in that situation, that they were in their late 70s, and moving out of the house was like letting go of a part of themselves, their identity, because they lived in the house for over 50 years.
it is. Yeah, I don't want to use a word. I mean, traumatic is a very dramatic name, a word, but
But it
it
is. I
it
mean, it's a
is. It
physical.
listen. Here's the thing: as we age, and you're right. My well, I had an amazing mother for one thing, who was like such a people person, and she gave me skills early on to be empathetic and understand and listen and so on. But it is. It's Value Pros works in assets and valuing assets. And we produce reports. Our biggest client is the federal government in the
Oh,
sense that producing reports for the IRS, we do a lot of appraisal work for the Department of Justice for seized assets with, those different departments. So, um,
so talk about that a little bit. Well, now you haven't piqued my
uh,
interest. So talk about how Value Pros is the name of your company.
yeah,
So I think one time I called you and you were like in the middle of a court situation.
yeah.
So you are called in as expert witnesses?
Yes. So I mean, at the end of the day, as independent accredited appraisers, we're producing, it's called USPAP compliant, but it's just Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practices. So it just means that the appraisal procedure and the presentation of the report meets the standards or the requirements that insurance companies require for obtaining insurance coverage, right? For government agencies like the IRS for the date of death, or for charitable donation, for a tax deduction, and for the courts, of course, for maybe marital dissolution, divorce.
Mhm.
Okay. So at the end of the day, I mean, we're producing real reports that have financial impacts. It may cost people taxes, it may reduce their taxes for a charitable donation, right? Or it may be a valuation dispute between a tenant and a landlord. The thing is that, we're trained and then we produce something that others rely on to make decisions or for court cases or so on. So there's a very certain way that we must do it, and it's not our way, it's the professional standard of how it has to do. So when people read our report, they have confidence that it was done a certain way, and then that way it reduces the problem of continuing. Okay? So for instance, when there's an equitable distribution among beneficiaries, there may be some very
Dispute.
common contention among family members. And it's yeah,
No,
that's
I can't imagine that ever
that's
being a
right.
little sarcastic there, but, I mean, I would think that that would be probably the biggest risk for most families is that there is the assumption that mom's favorite painting that's sitting on the wall, she liked looking at it every day, but there was an actual value attached to it, and then who gets that?
Right, exactly.
And how is that distributed? And you have 4 children, 1 painting.
Right.
Does one child get it, or do you go ahead and make that appraisal, that official legal appraisal that is now into the court systems? It's being assessed and determined. And then what happens to that painting? There's a payout, someone it gets sold. It's just so what are the options there?
Right. So it allows, and I tell people right away, this service, this report allows you to step back from this issue because, Nikki, as you know, the dynamics that we walk into, and I dynamics
Yeah,
dysfunction, you can call it whatever you want. I call it
like
dynamics
really good
because it's more,
stories.
yeah, it's more positive. But those things were going on long before I ever came into the
Right,
picture. Okay.
right.
It's just that this situation oftentimes inflames it. And so therefore it makes resolving this even more difficult because you have those dynamics. So how I explain to people, again, back to planning, is that you can really eliminate that where you may not, it may not get so contentious. And then that helps the family going forward because you can say things that you might never take back or do things, right? So it kind of leads into that whole thing. But what I suggest to people is that this will allow you to step back from this, and then the report is what it is. Now you've got a level understanding of what decisions to make. Now, I can't help you with those decisions. I independently value assets, but at least now you've got the information to do it. And then at that point, yeah, you can then decide, okay, there is now if there's one painting and there's 4 siblings or 4 beneficiaries, you don't divide it up into quarters, of course, right? So then you're really talking about, okay, what is this painting in the whole picture of the other assets? And then perhaps this person gets this, and then that equates to so many other items that other people get. So you can,
You're
yeah, you can
negotiating
use
the
a
asset.
monetary value that way, where you could just start to even things out. And but the other thing is, it's not even so much about the things that do have more significant market demand. It's the things that people think have value and they don't. So actually, when we're doing an appraisal, just the fact that it's presented to them that there is not market demand or there's a lack of market demand, a lack of value, that in itself resolves an issue because perhaps one of the beneficiaries thought that it was very valuable and that
My
created the
aunt's
problem.
dolls,
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
like my aunt's
Yeah,
dolls, right? I
yeah,
mean, that
absolutely.
she thought she was leaving and people were divvying up the dolls, and then when we actually had them appraised, they weren't worth much.
Right,
So,
right,
then you're back to so the estate, then the beneficiaries of the estate really need to look at it the estate as a whole, right?
right,
Because not everything a painting might be worth more than a vase or a piece of jewelry, whatever that particular article is. And then, as you're saying, there might need to be some negotiation within the family to be able to make an equitable distribution.
right, right.
But when you're in the court systems, right, and you had mentioned that you're in some of these federal court systems, what is the biggest concern that the government has regarding is it the valuation that might have been initially placed on a particular item and that it's determined that it's actually worth a lot more, so the taxation of it?
Right, right.
Is that it?
Yeah, and forgive me, I did lose track there for a minute. You did ask me a question about testifying or expert witness testifying.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I do that often, and it's really more about I'm a witness, okay? So I'm not driving, I'm not an advocate for either side. I'm just a witness, but I happen to be an expert witness in this area which is appraising. So usually when I do expert witness testimony, they're asking me about what I did, how I did it, okay, and am I qualified to do it, and how long I've been doing. So it basically just tells the judge or the jury about, okay, this is the results that this expert produced, and how did you produce it? And that goes back to USPAP or the methodology. If I was outside of that, then boom, I get torn up, which I should. If I stay within that, how I'm trained, then the values are going to be correct. Now, somebody could certainly disagree with values, but usually it's from a standpoint of bias, right? So you've got two parties. One may probably want something to be valued higher, and one wants the same thing to be valued lower. They're certainly not an expert because they're not an appraiser, but they come to it with a bias and so I'm the one that is a third party, independent, disinterested. I don't care the values, it's market driven and so on. Now, what the courts use values for, and one thing that trips up people quite often is that they may have had assets appraised previously for insurance coverage. It's very common, right? Especially
Mhm.
with these horrible fires out in the West and the floods in the East and so on. So now our business has jumped. It's understandable. There's been a shock to their consciousness. Oh my gosh, you know, I don't have this. I don't know what it is. I don't have it insured. I don't have. Okay, so and that's good because you really should. Okay, so that's a good thing. But people, there's replacement value, which is an insurance value. Okay, and that's always higher for an item because it's based on replacing it. And in theory, you can't replace it. It's a check that's paid to you. But in theory, it's based on you must replace this item and it must be done quickly. Okay.
Right.
You can't sit around for a year. The insurance company can't sit around for the year, look at the market and say, okay, over a year's time, we see all these comparable items. And no, they got to cut you a check. So, what is it based on? Retail. Where could you go out and literally buy this item again to replace it? And it costs more at retail. A For estate purposes or for the government purposes for uh, charitable donation, estate tax, it's based on what the item is currently selling for now in the secondary market. Okay.
Right.
And so that's a lower value. So where people get tripped up is, oh, yeah, I got that stuff appraised 10 years ago for insurance. And now these values for estate purposes, meaning for dividing the assets or selling the assets, that's what the value is. It's not. It's a
It's not.
it's a total different value. Okay. Yeah. And so
Well,
that
just to wrap up a little bit here, it's fascinating to see how the market will play into this estate planning process and the appraisal process as well. So, what are some things that people can do today that they probably aren't, but should be?
okay. It's a great question. I think what they should do first off is just take a mental inventory first. Just look around and say, what do I want to go forward with in my life? Like, what is either so sentimental to me and it has nothing to do with value, right? What is sentimental that I want with me? Okay. And
And then that's down in that next phase of life, that downsizing, the
Right,
right?
right. So, because if you're downsizing or managing, you don't need as much anymore. You have a smaller footprint. So, you can't take this much and then fit it into this size, right? So, you've got to make some decisions. Okay. So, the first thing is it has nothing to do with value. What do you want with you? What gives you peace? What gives you joy? What gives you pleasure to look at? That's the stuff that goes with you. Okay. Now, the other stuff, do you need it? Do you need it? Okay. And if you don't need it, or it's redundant, or it's more of, then that's what you got to get a handle on. So now you're making decisions based on value. Now, if you don't care about value, then Give it to the less fortunate. Give it
Rip,
away.
throw.
Whatever.
Either donate it, air it, or sell it.
That's right. Yeah. And
Donate it, air it, or sell it is what I
that's right.
always say.
So basically just take a stock of your life and your possessions. And when you need to make decisions based on value, get an independent value. And this is the thing that I say to almost everybody. Never ask somebody what something is worth when they want it from you. If you don't know the value of it and they do, and they want it from you, don't ask them, because that's not the value of the item. That's a person who's going to tell you it's worth this much, and they're going to get it for as little as possible, and then they're going to profit from really what it's worth. So when you need to make decisions on asset, be it jewelry, art, collectible, furniture, whatever, and you want to make an informed decision, pay for an independent appraisal. Because if you say, well, I don't want to pay for an appraisal, this guy will tell me what it's worth. You're still going to pay for it. You're just going to pay
Somewhere.
for it in another way. Yeah.
And with that, Ray, thank you so much. Where can people find you if they're looking for your services?
Absolutely. Well, certainly you can jump right onto our website at valuepros.com. And if you looked at Ray Nugent, I've got a site out there with a book and so on. So reach out to a great percentage of the people that contact us. There's not an engagement, but we're going to get you on the right track. We're going to put you in the right direction that's in your best interest. So, Niki, I really enjoyed this. This was awesome. I feel like I could talk to you for 3 hours because your questions are so good.
Well, thank you again.
Okay.
And we'll end here. Appreciate your time, Ray.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. I hope this conversation inspired you to take control and plan for the inevitable to protect yourself and those you leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at digitallegacypodcast.com. Remember, life is full of surprises. What happens after you die shouldn't be. So keep your passwords safe and your playbook up to date.